Well, we started out last week, if you remember, with an illustration, kind of a math question, right? If you're the bottom of the hill and you got a truck coming down one way and a bike coming down another, I asked the question, which one would make the biggest impact? Now, the answer seems obvious, but the mathematical answer is the one with the most momentum. Remember, I introduced you to the math equation, which I don't completely understand, but this is what they say. Momentum equals mass times velocity. So basically, you have something really huge that's not moving at all. It won't make much, doesn't have much momentum, and won't have a big impact. You can have something small that's moving very fast in a singular direction, and it'll make a big impact. It's mass times velocity. And velocity basically is speed with direction. So if you have a bunch of people running and they're all running in different directions, there's not much of impact. But if they're all together and they're running in the same direction, there's an impact. You got mass all moving with speed in the same direction. And we talked about how God has designed the church to make an impact. And so if we want to make an impact, we need to have momentum. We need to have as many of us as possible heading in the same direction that is practice at some sort of speed. And when we do that together, there is a greater impact. And so I also then introduced you to the overall mission of the church, the impact that God would have us make. And you remember, we said that the mission of the church is to go into the world and make disciples by declaring the gospel of Jesus Christ in the power of the Spirit, and gathering disciples into churches that they might worship the Lord and obey His commands now and into eternity to the glory of God the Father. And then specifically last week, we took a look at the idea of the gospel of Jesus Christ, because everything flows both in of and out of this good news. And just kind of recap really quick, right? The good news is, first of all, there is a God and He loves you. God exists and He cares about you. As a matter of fact, He created you and I to be in relationship with Him. Now, it's not a relationship of equals. He is God. He is Master. He is Lord. We are His servants. We are His children. We serve Him. But yet He designed us to be in relationship. However, there's a problem. We are separated from God. The truth is that you and I are devoted to being on the throne of our own lives. That doesn't mean that we can't do some good. We do try to do some good, but our good usually is about making us feel better about being on the throne of our lives. It's usually not about God. And so we have this huge separation from God. And it's more than just can we follow the rules. It fundamentally is about God ruling. But Jesus is the bridge to God. We could not build that bridge. We could not get off the throne, but God understood that. And Jesus did something that none of us could do. He lived the life with God on the throne of His life, if you would, the Father in charge from beginning to the very end. And not only did that, but He gave His life on a Roman cross to pay a penalty for the fact that we want to be on the throne of our own lives. But we have to do something with this bridge. We have a choice. Remember? We said we have to do something. We have to confess. We have to understand that we are separated. We do fundamentally always want to be on the throne. Confess that before God, that I missed the mark. I am, the biblical word is sinner. I want to be on the throne, but you should be. And I believe that you did for me through Jesus, specifically God in the flesh, through Jesus. You did for me what I could not do for myself. And then I act on that. I step out on the cross. My life begins to show that I've made that commitment, that I'm choosing that God be God and I'm not. And the result is we're restored back in a relationship with God. Now, remember we said that verse, for God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, that whoever believes shall not perish, but what? Have everlasting life. And Jesus says this is eternal life. This is everlasting life. What? That they may know you and the one you sent, Jesus. It's about relationship. And that is to the glory of God now, and it will be to the glory of God to eternity. Heaven is not a place for the good. Heaven is a place for those who like God on the throne. Another way to look at this is, though we're designed for this, we really are looking, if you would, the other way. We were created to be in relationship with God, our Father, our Lord, our Master, but many folks today, and a growing number of folks, don't even know of him, let alone truly believe or want him to be on the throne. They're not even looking. Their eyes are somewhere else. Their eyes are on building their own kingdom. Their eyes are on their own throne. So obviously, but the step to understand, to move towards the good news, right? They have to put their eyes on God. You must believe there is a God. You must believe that God is good and loving. And at some point you must believe and come to understand that that love was expressed through the cross. But again, this information alone, just knowing this, just going from, I'm not even thinking about God, I don't even know he exists, to, okay, he exists and I understand this Jesus thing, okay. You're not there yet. You haven't experienced the good news. The good news is when we act upon it. There's a personal response where we begin to yield. This is where we give our life to the one who gave his life for you. This is where we respond to the cross. We're not just looking, but we yield to it. We devote our lives to it. And that brings us to our second aspect of impact. Back to our mission statement, right? After the gospel of Jesus Christ, we gather all folks who've responded to the gospel, to the good news, that understand that good news. They respond by faith to Jesus. And then we gather them into this word we call church. And all church is, it literally means gathering. But ever since the New Testament, church is the gathering of those who've responded to the good news. That's all it is. It's not a building. Doesn't need a steeple or a cross. It's not limited to location or color. It's limited only to those who believe and responded to the good news. We are not just at this location. Trinity Church isn't the only church. It isn't one of the churches, actually. We're just part of the overall church. The church is anybody and everybody who's responded to the good news of Jesus Christ. And this is one particular gathering, one particular church. And so we gather these disciples, if you would, and then it says that there's several things we do. And the first thing is that they might worship the Lord. Going back to our picture, right? This is actually the beginning, and I guess in some ways the end. Because if you remember, worship is to bow down. Worship is to surrender. I taught on this, if you might remember, about a month ago. On December 23rd, right, part of our Oh Holy Night, I taught about worship. And the fact that we are to only worship God, divine worship that is. We're only to divinely worship. Give our lives to God and him alone, Exodus 20. And then we also talked about eventually every knee, whether you're a child of God, whether you're a believer or not, eventually it says every knee in Philippians 2, every knee will bow. Every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. Everyone will bow. Eventually. However, today I want to talk about, I do believe there's a difference. I do believe that time will come when all the nations of all time will stand before God, and all of a sudden God's glory, Jesus himself, will be revealed in all of his divine glory, and the response will be overwhelming. Everyone will hit the ground. They'll be so overcome. There'll be no excuses. There'll be no ifs, ands. It'll just be his glory will be revealed, and everyone will hit the ground because his glory is so amazing, so overwhelming. But I do think for God's children, there'll be a difference in their bended knee. It won't just be a visceral response to, I can't take his glory. I can't look at him. I can't stand in his presence. But for us, there'll be a willingness of heart. There'll be a different motivation, if you would. And I believe that motivation is love. And that's what I want to talk about. I think worship flows, for God's children, it flows from love. Right? That's the greatest commandment, Deuteronomy 6. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. When they asked Jesus what the greatest commandment is, he quotes Deuteronomy 6. So he'll quote Leviticus as well, and we'll talk about that next week. But his first thing is love God with everything. Everything inside, everything out there, everything you have, everything you want to be. Love God. This is why, by the way, I think it's so important that we understand God's good news. Because if we understand it, if we've experienced it, if it's real to us, then the natural reaction, the general reaction is love, which comes out in worship, what comes out in a bended knee. However, I do want to say I believe that we need to understand that love is a process. This whole love God with everything doesn't happen like that. Love doesn't happen like that. I know the story. He saw her, she saw him, and they instantly fell in love. No, they didn't. Did it start there? Absolutely. I have no problem believing that. But that's not really where full love is experienced. It's a process. In 1991, a while ago, I met my lovely bride, Lynn. And at that point, I was a very proud and flamboyant young man, and she was a career woman. And we worked well together, but there wasn't much else there. And it was interesting as this great work relationship budded into a friendship, which eventually budded into being best friends. And 5 years later, 1996, it's a long story, which I don't have time to go through. I asked her to marry me. Now, we were in a unique position because we never dated. I never tried to impress her because we were just hanging out. We were just being ourselves. As a matter of fact, we didn't go out on our first romantic date. This is honest to God, this is true. Till a month after we got engaged. I told you, it's a long story. The important thing I want to stress, though, isn't that, because only God can do that, but I'm constantly reminded of what a rare gift that was as I counsel other married couples. Because Lynn and I had the opportunity to really get to know each other with a lot of the walls that young couples put up unintentionally. They don't even think that they're doing it, right? When two people, and they don't have to necessarily be young couples, it could be an older couple that are new to each other, right? It seems like your differences don't even matter. It seems like love will conquer all. And you think that's going to be, you're going to feel that way forever. No, you won't. And I'm not being prophetic, and I'm trying not to be a Debbie Downer either. It's just that's the way life works. Because if you ever go to marriage a seminar or a workshop, or you read stuff online about marriage, you will always come across different ways of saying it, but they'll talk about the stages of marriage or the stages of love. And there could be 3, there could be 6, there could be 12, but they all generally follow the same pattern. There is the honeymoon phase. In the honeymoon phase, all is good. No one really has any problems. You're just love this person, and they love you, and everything's good. And if it's not good, it doesn't really matter because love conquers all. And right? Now, any parent here, if your son or daughter comes to you and says, "I've known this guy for 3 months, and now we're getting married," you're like, "Let's talk about this." Even if you're a hopeless romantic, let's talk about this. Why? Because you know the honeymoon ends. It always ends. Even those couples who share their story, we looked at each other and it was love at first sight. I do believe, again, I believe love can start like that. But if you listen to their story, the honeymoon ended. 50 years later, they don't get up and look across and so that same gaze, that same kind of, oh. Now, one of the cool things about older couples at 50 years, there's still something there, but it ain't what it was in the beginning. And that's actually a good thing. The next stage, or stages, depending on what you're reading, basically, I call this reality hits, right? It's that time when inevitably, whatever self you put on the shelf for that honeymoon period, right? We can't sustain that forever. All of a sudden, I care about the fact that I don't really like Italian food. All of a sudden, I care about the fact that though you're great and amazing, the fact that you leave your junk everywhere is driving me crazy. And reality kind of comes in, and this clash of wills begins to happen as we begin to do life together, and as that romance begins to kind of wear off a little bit, and we get familiar with one another. And this is where couples really begin to struggle, because they don't realize that for a long time when problems came up, they just rode on the high of their feelings to get through it. They never developed communication. They never developed trust and acceptance. And this is where most marriages or dating relationships begin to break up, because it's too hard. I must not be in love anymore. And by the way, you're not in lust anymore. That's true. That is ended. And that, by the way, is where love begins. Real love begins. Where you begin to do the hard work of accepting somebody for who they are. And then the last stage, or again, stages, depending on how they divide it up, basically is, I understand she ain't all that. And she knows I ain't all that. But we have learned to accept one another and maybe even appreciate our idiosyncrasies. I know that drives me crazy, but you know what? There's so much that just kind of turns me on. I don't care about going a little crazy. I'm not trying to change her. She's not trying to change me, but we've learned to kind of settle in. We've learned, in essence, kind of to surrender to one another. The relationships that get there are so inspiring. Loving God is no different. It's a process. So I want to take you through that process, right? I'm going to go back to our graphic, right? I think there's a place, right, where we yield to God a little bit. And we say to God, I love you, or I want to love you, but it's just begun. It's kind of like saying to someone, I'm interested in you, or maybe even I want to marry you. It is just begun. The first step, I believe, is to get to know them. You cannot truly love someone unless you know them, really know them. This is one of the reasons why marriage is so tough. Why, especially in those first 2 years, because you begin to get to know the real person. Because now it's not just an hour here and an hour there. It's 24/7, right? And all of a sudden it's bad breath in the morning and bad habits in the around the house, and they're not always in a good mood, and on and on and on. And you have to share stuff and make decisions, and you had yours, she had hers, and the time you guys were together, you shared, but then you got to go back to your own stuff in your own way to do things however you wanted to do them. Now you're married, and now you don't get to escape anymore back to your comfortable throne. You got to bring those two thrones together. Ah! As you learn to know more and more about each other, this takes time and consistency. Let me give you an example. Let's say there's a couple, Jack and Jill. And this is Jack and Jill's life. Jack works evenings and Jill works during the days, Monday through Friday. So when one is home, the other one's working, and when the other one comes home, the other one's got to go to work. On Saturday, there's a long list, because of the way their lives are and how stressful it is, of things that need to be done. There's a lawn that needs to be mowed, and a house that needs to be cleaned, and bills that need to be paid. And so they're both working really, really hard on doing all their chores, if you would, on Saturday. But on Sunday morning, they have this standing time together. They meet together at 9 a.m. for breakfast. And they share breakfast, and they talk about life from 9 to 11 every Sunday morning. And then about 11 o'clock, right, they're kind of weary from the week. And so he goes and watches football, and she reads a book, and they begin to try to recharge and get ready for another week to come. Now, would you be surprised if I told you that these two are struggling in their marriage? No. Why? because there's no communication. There's barely any time to connect. Once a week for 2 hours is not enough. Yet many of us, that's our relationship with God. These 2 hours is not 9 to 11 for y'all. It's 11 to 12:30, maybe a little bit before, a little bit after. And you wonder why you're struggling with God, why he seems so distant. No relationship could survive like that. Not a one. Jesus, who was God in flesh. So God says this. He says, abide in me. He's telling this to his disciples, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, so neither can you unless you abide in me. Dwell in me. What he's using an example, they're actually they're walking up the Mount of Olives, and between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives is probably vineyards. And they're walking through a vineyard. And if you've driven down 5 about this time of year in the winter, right? You drive by a vineyard, usually a lot of them are just this big stick come up out of the ground. That's it. That's the branch. That's the main branch. And then later on in the spring, out of that branch, the vines will grow out of. But if you obviously cut the vine from the branch, the vine's going to die. And so Jesus, walking through this vineyard, says, listen, do you really want to accomplish something in life? You must be attached to me. You must remain in me. You must abide, hang out, communicate, be with me. Because if you don't, you're like a vine detached from the branch. You'll just wither and die. Just, by the way, like a relationship. If the two aren't connected, no life flows. And it begins to dry up. This is one of the reasons we stress so much to read God's story. To read his word. This is where he initially begins to reveal himself. And all of God's word. It's kind of like devoting yourself to marrying somebody, and yet, you know what, all you're interested in is your relationship together. You never looked about what their life was before. And then you know what happens? Things begin to come up, right? They begin to act certain ways. They begin to respond certain ways. You don't realize that you're responding to their father because you never knew that about their story. You don't realize that you're dealing with chronic bulliness when they were in school or whatever the case may be because you never heard their story. You take it personal. And there's tension. There's so much to God's story here. And if you want to understand how he's ebbing and flowing in your life, and some of by the way, God doesn't explain himself a lot. But he does give us some clues in this. You got to read. You got to know his word. You got to know him. He's revealed through his word. The ultimate word, by the way, being Jesus himself. In the beginning was the Word, John 1:1. And the Word became flesh. And then we have the Holy Spirit in us that makes that begin to come alive. And we must communicate to him in prayer. Not just in us talking to him, but listening. It's just like good. I mean, how many, you don't have to raise your hand, but how many people here know that though we both speak English, manese and womanese are different? You think we're communicating the same. The sentences are the same, but the meaning is different. Is absolutely difference between manese and womanese. And part of that, again, part of that relationship of getting to know one another is to know what they're really communicating. So when I asked my wife at the beginning of our marriage, would you like, or where would you like to eat tonight? And she said, I don't care. She doesn't mean I don't care. She means I don't want to choose. Those are two different things. Because I don't care to me means, okay, we'll go eat Mexican. And then when she says, I don't want to eat there, I'm like, then you care. Why did you say that? Well, she did. She was just speaking womanese. So by the way, guys, this is free, especially if you're in the new relationship. I just used to say, hey, would you like to eat Mexican, Chinese, or Italian? And then if she had an opinion, she'd say, oh, anything but Mexican. But I made the choice. Because I was beginning to learn. I'm still learning to speak womanese. And communicating God in prayer is the same way. This abiding. We ask God and we say, God, I'd like you to do this, but then we got to stop and listen. And what is God communicating? What's he selling in our heart? And sometimes I got a feeling that God wants me to do this, and you try that, and it completely falls apart, and you're going, okay, I obviously don't speak Godese. Got to go back to the drawing board. And you go back and say, God, I missed that one. Let me hear again, and then maybe something else. Maybe there's a sense of I wouldn't do this, but I feel like I should do this. And you do that thing, and something amazing happens, or works. You're like, oh, got to remember that sounds like Godese. God speaking. But if you don't work on that relationship, you'll totally miss that. Imagine the impact. If we didn't just talk about somebody that we know about, but somebody that we know. Imagine a gathering of people that didn't talk about an historical figure, but somebody they met this morning. I spent time with Jesus this morning. Imagine the impact of that. About daily meeting with him. See, personal stories of the God you know, of the Jesus you know, are so much more impactful than an historical account. For the world, Jesus was a historian. For us, he's the real, living, breathing, existing lover of our lives, Lord of our lives, who's available 24/7, unlimited. We must know him. But it must not just be in our heads. It must also go to what we do, our hands and our feet. It's an issue of what I call trust. Relationships rise and fall on trust. You'll see in this next graphic, right? It as we kind of continue around the circle, it moves from our head to our hands and our feet. It's about trusting him. So you know him, so you know what he wants to do. But do you trust him enough to try? Every healthy relationship is built on trust. And if you don't have trust, you don't have a healthy relationship. This is one of the main barriers as couples who have been wounded come in for premarital counseling, and they're like, help us. So we begin to talk about this. And what you quickly find as anyone who does any kind of counseling is there's always two sides. Both sides always have something that needs to be improved. It's never just one side. Now, one side might have 51% of the deal, but everyone has something. And so he talks about how she's wounded him, and she talks about how he has wounded her. And you begin to realize that they've developed in this pattern. Now they get up, there is no trust whatsoever. And so they began to throw bombs, if you would, at each other. And because they know each other so well, they know exactly the buttons that will make that person pay. And in their mind, they're justified because he started it. I'm just responding. I'm just protecting myself. And in his mind, he's justified because she started. And so you begin to work through these issues, and you begin to kind of talk about how there's no way to move forward if they don't learn to trust one another. And are they willing to do this? And most of the time, at the very beginning, they at least say to some sort, because it's reasonable, yeah, we'll try. Yeah, we'll try. But here's the problem. Initially, almost every couple, especially that's in crisis, fails at this. Because we try really means, as long as he behaves himself, I'll behave myself. I'm willing to try. And he's saying, I'm willing to try as long as she behaves herself, I'm willing to behave myself. And they'll kind of white knuckle it, and they might even have a good afternoon. But it could be as early as that evening, sometimes even the car ride home, where one of them will say or do something that reminds the other one of old habits. And then this person says, oh, I knew you would never change. And so they reach in to their button bag and they throw a grenade to protect themselves. And this person goes, I knew it. And then they throw their grenade and they come back a week later. It didn't work, Pastor. You need to try harder. Why? Because trust has gotten to the point where there is none. It's broken. It cannot move forward. Without trust, the relationship is doomed. And the key to restoring a relationship is to slowly rebuild trust, boundaries, and communication to understand that some of the times the things that you think are against you aren't really about you at all. And understanding and patience and on and on and on. Likewise, as we grow to know God, you'll find that we need to grow in our trust of him in every area of our life. It's the same way. You cannot love him without trusting him. As Jesus says, do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me. The context of this is, we're still in that section of John. Jesus is on his way up to the Mount of Olives, right? I talked about passing through the vineyard. But the disciples know something up because Jesus keeps talking about leaving them. Now, they're hoping that this is another one of those parable things where he's alluding to it, but it isn't really literal, but it's literal. And they're beginning more and more to think it's literal because of the way Jesus is acting. He's emotional. You can tell he's carrying a big burden. And so they begin to freak out, and this is when Jesus says, don't let your hearts be troubled. What's he saying? You can trust God, you can trust me. Listen, guys, you've been marching with me this whole time. You know me. You know how much I care about you. You know my power. And you know that I have your good in place. As a matter of fact, in this context, he's actually going to tell them, I'm going to prepare a place for you. This is all about you. But all they can see is in the right now, they're missing out. And Jesus says, trust me. Trust me. What are those small steps that God's calling you to right now to trust him in? Is it giving? Is it serving with your time? Is it forgiving someone? Confessing to someone a sin? Getting someone to partner with you in a certain area you're struggling with? What's that area where God says, I need you to do this? And you're like, but God, do you trust me? And think about the impact of that. Think about the impact where when life hits and you're like, your first default is, wait, I can trust him. Think about the impact when people look at his church and we don't just talk about historical somebody, but we talk about God and we're actually trying to do the things we believe. We actually are trying to love each other. We actually are trying to love others imperfectly, driving each other crazy at times, absolutely. But authentically. When you see a couple that has this genuine trust between them, it can't help but warm your heart. And you may think it's distant from you, but it's something you desire. I believe when the world, Jesus said, they will know you are my disciples. What? How you're loved from one another. And you cannot have love without trusting and leaning on one another. Leaning on imperfect people in imperfect ways to the glory of a perfect God. That will have an impact. And I believe as we do this, we grow to one of the mature stages of which very few people reach. And we acknowledge this when we see it, and it's surrender. Right? In our circle, it's not just in your head, it's not just in your hands and your feet. It impacts the heart. It begins, if you would, to transform you. You are different. And here's the cool thing about real love. Real love does not change her. By the way, my wife's back there running the slides, so that's who I'm pointing at. Real love changes me. Real love changes me. I change so I can become the best person I can to love and be the partner that God has designed me to be for her. And for her sake, hopefully, as well. She'll do the same. It's a surrender love is when you know and trust someone so much that when you do something or say something that outwardly seems off or even hurtful, you still remain at peace because you believe that despite what is seen, they have your best in mind. So let me give you some small examples before I go to the grand example. I remember a comedian one time talking about how his parents had entered into this weird stage he didn't understand. And he exampled they're driving home, and dad was driving, and mom was in the passenger seat, and he's in the back. And as they're going home, dad passes the exit for their home. And he's like, Dad, there's, and mom's like, shh. Your dad will get us there when he wants to. They just reach this point where we don't correct dad. He'll get us there. There's just trust. In a small way, this is also, I hope, is example to our kids in that often our kids will come and they'll complain to me because mom reacted in a certain way. She's so unreasonable. She's so unloving. She's out to get me. And I hope 100% of the time. I like to say 100% of the time. I can pretty much tell you it's over 90% of the time. I say, no, I know your mom. She does not hate you. She's not out to get you. She has your best in mind. Her motivation is love. Her motivation is love. Let me give you the best example of this, and we got to go outside of people. In Matthew 26, Jesus sees the crosses before him on my account and your account. And he goes and he asks God, hey, is there, this is my words, a plan B? God says no. And then it picks up in verse 42. It says, he, being Jesus, went away a second time and he prayed, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. In other words, if there's no other way around this, then we'll go through it. And then verse 43 says, when he came back, in other words, back to his disciples, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he's all alone now. He's overwhelmed with grief. So what does he do? He goes back. So he left them and he went away once more and he prayed a third time, saying the same thing. 3 times Jesus goes to the Father. Now remember, God left the throne of heaven and chose to encase himself in flesh, to feel what we feel. And so what he sees before him, first of all, is a separation between he and the Father, because he's going to bear yours and my sin. And so there will be separation between the two of them, which has never happened in all of eternity to that point. Second of all, he is going to go through the physical torture, even unto death. And no human being desires that. And any human being who could get out of that situation would get out of that situation. But here's Jesus. He shows us surrender. Jesus goes before the Father and says, God, every ounce of my being says, no. But, Father, I know you. Father, I trust you. And so, Father, I surrender to you. Let my life be a living sacrifice. Let my life be worship to you. And if this is your will, yes, 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 yes. That, my brothers and sisters, is love. And it's all its maturity. What might God be calling you to that seems absolutely contradictory to what you believe or experience? It just doesn't seem like God wouldn't call me to do that. How many times I've had somebody sit in my office and they have a tough decision. Maybe they're in a hard marriage, or they have a hard job, or they're dealing with someone in ministry that's a hard person to deal with and they want to quit. And their excuse is, well, God wouldn't want me to be unhappy. Jesus didn't use that line. If anyone could have used that line, if anyone could have said, hey, excuse me, Father, look at what I've done for you. I mean, from day one, it's all been you. Could maybe we just do me one time? No, he says, I surrender. I surrender. And I can guarantee you, if you're a follower of God, I can guarantee you, you're going to have to, at one time, respond to him by faith. He's going to bring you to a precipice, and he's going to ask for something that seems absolutely contradictory to your common sense. He may ask for some savings. He may ask you to give up a lucrative job and do something else. He might ask you to commit your time every week to something at the church or another ministry outside of the church that just doesn't fit into your life right now. He may choose to let go of your kids and let them experience the natural consequences of their decisions rather than always rescuing them. I don't know what it is, but this is what I know. In that moment, every fiber of you will say, this doesn't make sense. My friends tell me that doesn't make sense. My experience says no one would do that. But at that moment, if you know God, you know he's always good. He wouldn't call that to you unless he had something pretty special in mind. And if you trust God over time, you've taken little steps and he's shown himself to be faithful, then that will yield to surrender. that will yield to surrender. To love God, to truly worship Him, is to know Him. To know that you're accepted and loved unconditionally. That's the story here. That's what He wants you to know. And then in that, you're going to learn that He's got a plan for your life. And sometimes it's contrary to your flesh. Sometimes it's don't do this thing that you really want to do. I really want to live with him right now. I know we're not ready for marriage, but I really want to live with him or her right now. No, I got something better for you than that. The government really won't know if I don't claim this, that, or the other thing. God's like, no, I got something better for you. You begin to trust him and say, okay, I'll try it your way. And you begin to see him be faithful over and over again. And that yields itself to surrender. That yields itself to surrender. Here's one way to look at it. Hebrews 11:6 says this. And without faith, it's impossible to please God. In other words, you must surrender to him. Because, now this is what it's saying. In order to surrender, because these are two things that have to happen. One, anyone who comes to him must what? Believe that he exists. You must know him. You'll never respond to faith. You'll never worship him if you don't believe that he exists, if you don't know God. And that you also must believe that he rewards those who are earnestly seeking him. In other words, you can trust him. If you know him, if you can trust him, then you will respond in faith. If you're not responding in faith, it's not because you're not trying hard enough. It's because you don't know him. It's because you're not stepping out little by little in trust and faith. One flows from the other.